Okay, well, welcome everyone. This is the latest session in Mercent's Thought Leadership panel. The crossroad between growth and profit. We're going to be talking about dynamic pricing during this session. So thanks for your time and attention. I'm here today with Steve Rowan. Steve, thanks for attending. Steve is with RSR Research, and they are a leading research firm dedicated to the retail and e-commerce industry. And Steve, can you tell us a little bit more about your company?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And RSR Research, the short version is we are an analyst firm that is slightly different than any of the other analyst firms that you may know a little bit about. We don't ever compare one vendor against another. All that we do is retail, and all that we do is market intelligence, never competitive intelligence. The way that we gather most of that, there's four major partners, myself, I have 3 partners as well. All of us come from lifelong retail backgrounds. 2 of my partners actually were former lifelong CIOs at large retail chains. And so we sort of come to the table with our opinions, and the way that we either validate or prove these opinions to be wrong is we conduct research every single year. We do anywhere between 12 and 14 benchmark studies where we'll pick a topic, always retail specific. We don't ever step outside of retail. So every year we do a pricing survey, every year we do an e-commerce survey, every year we do a loss prevention survey. And we go out and we ask retailers about the business challenges and the opportunities that they perceive around any one of these technologies. And from what they tell us, we look at it in a couple of different ways. Obviously, we look at it in aggregate. Everything that we do is blinded, so retailers we've built a really strong rapport with them where they're very willing to tell us some sort of personal information, some behind-the-scenes challenges and organizational inhibitors that they might be facing on whatever topic it is we're talking about. But then we also look at that data based on performance segment, and one of the things that we find, regardless of the topic, is that the best performing retailers look at problems differently. They don't succeed by accident. They succeed because they look at the common business challenges that all retailers face, and they're much better at converting them into opportunities because they look at them usually by saying, what can we do internally to meet this challenge head on? And what we find in laggards, which is a term that we use oftentimes for retailers whose sales aren't doing all that well, is they're much more likely to look externally and say, well, the problem must be over there, or the solution must be over there, and then they all kind of run in that direction. So as you and I have a conversation today, I'll probably be sharing a lot of information from our most recent pricing survey, and it's important to keep in mind that the difference between that winning retailer group and the lagging retailer group really helps us make predictions for what's coming in the very near future.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks for the intro, and we'll revisit this theme of winners versus losers as we go. So we're here to talk about how Amazon and Google, together with the hypergrowth in mobile and tablet devices, have created a very interesting dynamic in the retail market today, where consumers have unprecedented access to real-time inventory availability and pricing information. I've got a quick setup slide here, and we're looking at the e-commerce market as a $250 billion market opportunity. Of course, offline commerce dwarfs that as a 10x market for consumer transactions and for merchant opportunity. And a couple of key observations that we've made at Mercent here is that when you're shopping on these closed environments, basically captive environments like an Amazon or Google, and there's a single product detail page where the consumer has the opportunity to convert, effectively these platforms and the decks of tablets and mobile devices create a winner-take-all environment where the owner of the add to cart button, the owner of the buy box, if you will, has the potential to take 98% of the market share for a particular product SKU in that environment. And when we look at the influence of that pricing information on offline purchases, it's important to note that up to half, and you guys probably have some insight into this, but up to half of offline purchases are now researched on a mobile device or an e-commerce channel.
At least.
At least. Yeah, I guess I've seen numbers that range from 50 to 84%.
Yeah, we don't do consumer research, but we've seen a lot of those same numbers. And I mean, anecdotally, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody that doesn't use a mobile device or some form of digital channel in one of the paths to purchase, even if they do take ultimate fulfillment in the store.
So why don't we start with this sort of as the framework? So first and foremost, can you talk a little bit about the mobile impact on e-commerce and on offline retail? And then maybe based on your comments, we'll move to kind of how that pricing transparency is affecting best practices within the market.
Yeah, I mean, if you back it from the pricing part of it first, so again, we conduct these surveys year over year, so we have this deep bed of research to pull from, and every year we get to kind of see how the needle moves. And we started asking questions in our store survey, believe it or not, about mobile and its effect on stores and its ability to drive people into stores, its ability for for the retailers to connect to consumers via those mobile devices. And in 2010, nobody cared. And by 2011, it was top of absolutely, everyone's priority list was, well, we know that everyone walking into our store has this little device that is extraordinarily powerful. I believe I've heard that it's actually more power in a modern smartphone than there was that NASA had at all of its disposal to send a man to the moon in 1960.
Sure.
So certainly that is what upset the apple cart, and it bleeds into the pricing technology. The pricing strategy that retailers had laid out, they had these really well-devised pricing strategies and plan, and then starting around 2011 and particularly in 2012, all of a sudden, consumers were able to just dissect those, just rip them to shreds. They started using those devices at the store shelf. If they weren't in a store, obviously, the ability to see that price transparency across whatever channel it might be is really what kind of threw this whole industry into what we call the race to the bottom. And it's completely skewed, pricing practices, regardless of a retailer's size, what product they might be selling. There's this constant, I think a lot of it is due to the fact that, this whole wave of mobile and digital channels aren't, helping the consumer see more about the pricing strategies that were available to them. I think that because that was born during the economic downturn, it sort of stayed with retailers that consumers are really price sensitive. There's really no evidence, there's no hard data to show that that's the case anymore, but it's kind of ingrained into the culture now. So everyone is constantly believing that in our pricing survey, for instance, retailers tell us that dynamic pricing can help them to drive top-line sales and also improve gross margin. But if all they keep doing is undercutting each other in this constant race to the bottom, it doesn't really help anyone do either of those things. So, I'm sorry, you were going to jump in.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah. So it's interesting because I think at Mercent we have a bit of a different perspective. One of the things that we've observed, we sort of we take a different position on the race to the bottom
sure.
assumption, if I can call it that, in that as we see retailers with the ability to price more frequently, and again on the topic of mobile, as we think about the implications for in-store conversions and in-store behavior, it seems that the volatility of the prices increases. You and I were talking earlier, and there's gross margin implications for that, but ultimately, if you can price intra-second or effectively in real time, aren't you really providing a more perfect market situation for the consumer in terms of reflecting your real-time inventory availability, your strategy in terms of growth versus margin, and your brand value and so on?
Yeah, I would say it certainly varies by channel. For stores, no, because there is a repercussion of every time that you make one of those price changes. Now that has to roll out all through your store labor force, and there's a burden there that's associated. When you start talking about online, absolutely, I agree with you that if you're going to try to compete with Amazon and you're going to try to have a dynamic pricing model, then you absolutely, the one thing that we say is you have to be vigilant, right? You cannot rest on your laurels, not even for a day, because Amazon is playing around with a lot of interesting pricing dynamic pricing models. So you can't just set a price and forget it. We're not recommending that. But what the data does show us is that as we kind of come out of this great recession type of thinking, that the better performing a retailer is, the more likely they are to set a pricing model and stick to it.
Okay.
Whereas the guys that are like the laggards, the ones that are kind of on the bubble, they're not doing so well, they're constantly looking over their shoulder, and they're constantly trying to just lower their prices based on what their competitors are doing. Now, I'm not saying that changing prices is a negative thing, but if you're just sort of arbitrarily doing it and there's no plan in place, it's one of the things that shows up in our research a lot is we talk about plan, execute, and measure. But when it comes to pricing, so far retailers are really honest with us. They tell us, we don't have any way to really plan what a price change is going to do. And then on the back end of it, we don't really have any way to measure how effective it was. So, if there are solutions that help with that, then certainly that's something retailers are in need of.
So earlier you brought up the idea that there are sort of best practices for winners in the market, and then effectively everyone else is ignoring those best practices.
Sure.
If ignoring the price, the dynamic pricing paradigm, that we're seeing in the market at this point, as you just look through the mobile lens, what are some of those best practices that are specific to mobile pricing or not?
Yeah,
that you guys are seeing that really set some of these retailers apart?
It's early days for mobile, for sure. And one of the things that at the end of every one of our reports, and again, this is a small plug here, all of our research is available for free to anyone. So if you're interested in any of this, you can come to our site and download it. But one of the things that we do at the end of every one of our reports is we make what we call bootstrap recommendations. And it's usually 3 or 4 recommendations that retailers of all sizes, stripes, product segment, whatever it might be, can sort of work towards. They're not theoretical best practices to go chase for the next 10 years, and they're certainly not product-specific recommendations based on any vendor. But what they are is sort of, to your point, the trends that we are able to, through our lens, see from those winners on that particular topic. And one of the ones that we call on the mobile report is that you're going to have to experiment. We've seen there's been some fairly large-scale, adoptions on part of retailers to give all of their, store employees mobile devices. I think that if you really want to practically dip your toe in the water, pick a store and play with some of the mobile, both customer-facing and employee-facing technologies. Because if there's one thing we know about the difference between online and store-based retail, it's that people are coming to a store for a reason. We don't know what that is anymore. It really varies. You might go to the same store. I'm in the door 2 minutes after you. We're there for very different reasons.
It could be to pick up their order from an Amazon locker.
And I could be there just to touch 2 different, 2 different items to see which one's heavier because I'm lazy and I don't want to bring it around.
Right.
But the truth of the matter is, if a person's in your store and you're a cross-channel retailer who operates stores, they've chosen to come there for a reason. Try to give them an employee at absolute baseline that can answer their questions better than the device that they already have in their phone. And the best way you can do that is to arm your employees with those mobile devices. Now, when you get into the customer-facing stuff and trying to create the online experience in stores, it's funny, 5 years ago we were all talking about how do we make our online channel more like our stores, and now we're all saying, okay, how do we make our stores more like our online channel? It's much more, people enjoy it much more shopping online. Going to a store for most of us is kind of a frustrating, operation these days. So when you talk about mobile in stores, and how they can experiment with it, I would say you have to take a look at 2 different sides of the equation. One's employee-facing, one's customer-facing, and they're 2 very different things. One is just baseline, getting up to snuff, getting your employees able to be useful, because in my contention, it's better to have no employee there than a useless one.
Right, yeah, so there's sort of two sides to that equation, right? It's the personal interaction, personal experience that you have when you're in store, assuming that's appropriate or available. Sure. And then there's the subject matter expertise of the individual that you're interacting with. Right. Because I'm assuming that, oftentimes a mobile experience is more predictable and potentially more helpful if I'm dealing with a search engine than if I'm dealing with an unprepared employee, if I can paraphrase what you just said.
Yeah, and then there's the third part of it, which is really, okay, now the customer has this mobile device and they want to use it to basically go out and do, price comparison. And if we do, if you do agree that customers are more price sensitive than they are today, more price sensitive than they were even just a few years ago, then it becomes, as a retailer, where do you want to set your pricing structure? Do you want to just be able to compete with online retailers? Do you want to try to price match Amazon? Certainly that's going to be very difficult for any store-based retailer to do. So there's all different types of challenges associated with it, and it's really all brought on by just this rapid, this smartphones everywhere, all of a sudden completely ubiquitous.
It's interesting, you bring up the topic of pricing your in-store merchandise against online competitors. And from the public announcements, we've seen that companies as large as Target and Best Buy have been willing to make permanent the price matching policies that they were initially testing during
Walmart
the holiday.
did too, right?
Was it Walmart?
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got 3 major brick and mortar companies that ostensibly have real estate overhead, physical inventory overhead, carrying costs in these metropolitan markets, and they've decided, we're going to go head-to-head with an e-commerce company with potentially a fundamentally different operating expense profile. Sure. So Is that sustainable in your opinion?
It's not for the faint of heart, that's for sure.
Okay.
We wouldn't recommend that to any mom and pop retailer, any small and mid-sized retailer. If you have the supply chain where you can squeeze efficiency the way someone like Walmart or Target does, and you know that if you get someone through the door, there's a really good, for one particular item, and they know that they can get that at a price match, and now they're there and they're going to pick up all these other ancillary items. Good luck to you. I mean, basic retail 101 is you can compete on one of three things, right? You can compete on low cost, you can compete on an interesting product, or you can compete on customer service. And as the world sort of flattens out, and no one really has that really hot product anymore, it's all sort of ubiquitous. We saw what happened in the 90s when people tried to compete with Walmart in a landed channel fashion on price. That didn't work out well for them. If you're a pure play e-commerce retailer and you don't have stores and you want to try to be competitive with Amazon, we certainly recommend that. But for store-based retailers, I think, and this is sort of my own assumption. I don't really speak for my entire company when I say this, but we all have our own different opinions on the effects of showrooming. And it's one of the nice things about where I work is you're allowed to have your own different opinion. We don't have a company line on showrooming. My partner Paula doesn't believe it exists. I believe it exists to some degree. But in my idea, or in my viewpoint, all the customer really wants to do, if they're pulling out their phone and it's a large ticket item and they're going on and scanning it, they're using red laser, they're seeing what it is on Amazon, they're checking online, they probably just want to make sure they're not getting ripped off. If the product's right there, right in front of them at that time, and they can take fulfillment of it right there and then, and they don't have to wait 3 days, they don't have to pay shipping, they don't have to go through all that, chances are you can grab them if you're price competitive. Are there people who are absolutely willing to, drive to a store, burn X amount of gas to get there, go and look at an item and then go home and order it online or order it from the mobile device in store? Absolutely. But trying to be price matched with Amazon, you better have a lot of efficiency through your supply chain and know that when that person is in the store, you're going to sell them a lot of other items as well.
Yeah, you made some really, I think, astute comments about planning, execution, and then measurement, right?
Sure.
And from a planning standpoint, I mean, some of the things that we're hearing from our customers at Mercent, in the role that we play where we're dynamically pricing their products
Sure.
On certain channels like Amazon, is that they don't necessarily want, certainly in stores, they don't necessarily want or need to be matching a price, but they feel that the online signal is important in terms of setting a threshold above which they never want to fall, right? So in other words, it's okay to be 10% higher,
Right.
from a convenience standpoint, but it's not okay to be 25%. And in your pricing studies, do you have any indications of whether retailers are sort of arriving at this as is there a price discrepancy between the convenient in-store item
Right.
and the less convenient online item?
We actually have year-over-year data on that idea of what are you going to do about Amazon's pricing? Are you going to try to beat it? Are you going to try to match it? Are you going to try to just be competitive with it? And over the last 3 years, I don't have the exact numbers off the top of mind, but there's been a steady slope away from that we're going to try to beat it to we're going to try to match it to now we're just trying to stay competitive. Now, granted, that's from 100 different retailers all over the world, from all different walks of whether or not they're pure play or whether they're cross-channel or just brick and mortar retailers. But certainly the higher performing group, those retail winners, tell us that their pricing model is going to be their pricing model. They're going to set it. Sure, they'll make sure that they're competitive, but they're not going to constantly throw these price changes out there without having, to your point, having any implications or any idea of what the implications of that are. We've referred to it in the report actually as flying blind. A lot of these pricing and promotional deals have just been sort of thrown out there arbitrarily without any knowledge of what impact they have on the consumer or on the retailer's bottom line.
Right.
So I think we're sort of reaching a turning point where particularly the most forward-looking retailers are starting to say, okay, enough of that. Let's be competitive, and then let's try to measure effectively what we're doing.
Yeah, here's a counterpoint for you just on
Sure.
that. So we have this interesting profile of customer company merchant that we serve at Mercent, and we started seeing this about 18 months ago, where merchants were basically sending us catalog data without a price attached, and they were saying,
Okay.
we're not going to even guess what the prevailing consumer price point on this will be. And in fact, across the board, based on an average take rate margin that we need to hit, we're going to set a fixed floor across the catalog, and we're just going to let the algorithm set the price.
Okay.
And we've got a couple of customers in that market now that are doing $300 to $500 million in revenue through Amazon's third-party seller program.
Sure.
I still think there's a question whether they're sustainable long-term. There's cash flow implications. There's brand value implications. But have you come across this, or have you seen?
No, I mean, it was actually, in sort of the lead up to this conversation, I know one of the talking points was, have you seen any case studies for whether or not this is sustainable? And I was going to say, I hope you guys do. Because always, what we've seen is so far all over the map.
Yeah.
There's no okay, this is a best practice to go chase for that. If you have a case study, then I'd be very interested in seeing it.
Yeah. Okay, well, in the interest of time, any other closing comments, kind of coming back to this overarching theme of kind of winning best practices versus all others in the market, either on the topic of mobile broadly or omni-channel retail that's, recent data you guys may have been seeing or recent trends in the market?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big question to sort of, summarize all that we've seen in the last, 12 months, essentially. But, as it relates to mobile, that's early ground. And experimentation is going to be, those who are willing to experiment will be rewarded, because if you can get out in front of the customer, it's like one of the analogies we always use is when the Walkman was invented. Customers didn't know they needed it until they saw it in front of them, then they knew that they needed it. There are going to be retailers who are going to come up with really creative ways of using mobile that customers can't put their finger on right now and say, that's what I need. But when they see it, they'll know it, and then that brand will be awarded with loyalty, and it'll stick for God knows how long. So the idea of let's sit on our hands and wait to see what the consumer tells us they want with mobile devices, and with app versus WAP and all that stuff, no, that's really not the correct approach if you want to get out in front of demand and create consumer loyalty. As it relates to pricing, it's kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, right? It's, okay, you've been doing something for a while, now it's time to measure how effective it's been and sort of see, before one of the things that we find is every time that retailers have data issues, they recognize that their data is dirty, and they say, okay, well, we know that we want to do more effective pricing and promotion, but in order to do that, we need to clean up our data first. So they go clean up their data, and then they come back to do the pricing thing, and the whole ecosystem has changed, because now omnichannel's here, and now social media is here, and now they have to go back and look at their data all over again. So
you're one cycle behind.
They're one cycle behind, and it looks like the bar isn't being raised. There's constant progress being made. It just seems like the goalpost is constantly being moved further away. So that's really kind of a different world. That's okay, measure what you have, whereas mobile is be a little more aggressive. That would be our overall recommendation.
Okay, well, Steve, with RSR Research, thanks so much for joining us at Mercent today. Some great commentary on the rise of mobile, the transparency of pricing on Google and Amazon, and the implications for omni-channel retailers. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.